right, Miss Lily, get over here.
Where's Lily?
Lily Cam is running.
Oh, yeah.
Lily. Is she in the room?
Did she leave?
She did, right? Lily is here. Happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and friends of Baylor. It's interesting. I've been traveling a lot. I keep running into people who have been watching our little YouTube cast. So greetings to everybody who watches. Appreciate you all watching, and also appreciate when people come up and say hello to me when I'm traveling. Anyway, vaccines in the news. We talked about it last week, but just to make sure everybody knows, the FDA has amended its emergency use authorization for the Moderna and Pfizer bivalent vaccines to try to make it easier for people to understand. And basically, what they say is, we're no longer using the monovalent. We're only using the bivalent vaccine, and that is the one that recognizes the original Wuhan variant spike protein and the Omicron B4, B5 variant. And that's for everybody from 6 months and older. So that's the only thing. And then the booster is also the bivalent, and the FDA just cleared for people over 65 to get a second booster. So Janet, that's cleared. All right, so as we've talked about a lot, reported cases are basically unusable because when people get sick, they test at home and it's not reported. But if we follow hospitalizations continue to go down, so that's a good indication that things are better. But remember, the virus has also gotten less virulent. In other words, it causes less disease, and so hospitalizations are no longer that great an indication of what's going on. And the best indication is, of course, now wastewater. And if you look at the wastewater data in the United States, it's really interesting. There's still 31% of reporting sites that are either one-fold or at least two-fold higher than the previous week. But the number of sites that are reporting increases has gone down from 42% to 31%. So it is going down, but there's still hot spots in the United States, and I've circled those, mostly in the Midwest, around Illinois, Indiana, some parts of Tennessee, western North Carolina, but there are individual pockets in Colorado, Southern California, around San Francisco, and parts of Oregon. So as I say, it's getting better along the coast. Predominantly, most of the new cases are going to be in the Midwest. But where those are increases, they're pretty substantial increases. There's still a lot of virus in the country. That's the bottom line. So if you get sniffles or you feel like you have an upper respiratory infection, the best thing to do is test for COVID right away. Flu is not around right now. RSV is not around. There are other viruses, but it's good to exclude COVID because it's very likely that you might have it and you don't want to infect older people who still are at risk for dying from that disease. Now, the good news is of the variants, XBB, which has been the most recent dominant strain, the one I caught, and many people got it if you've got it any time in the spring or recently. XBB represents almost the entirety of cases, 97% of all the variants. 70% are the XBB 1.5 that we've been talking about, but there are now 5 other variants that are closely related that account for about 30% of the variation. So, again, as long as the virus has opportunities to replicate in the Midwest and other places and around the world, variants will continue to emerge. We all hope that the variants are closely related to the XBB strain so that if you get infected with any of these, that it's pretty much immune protection from all the XBB strains. What will be a concern is, of course, if there's a big recombinant event and it's dramatically different, and then immunity from having recently acquired XBB would mean you're not immune protected anymore. So knowing that, we've talked a lot about this, the most important thing is to come up with a vaccine that can be much more broadly neutralizing. So there's been a couple of strategies. There's some strategies to take a bunch of different viral proteins like Novavax and stick them on a matrix and see if you can't get broad immunity that way. But there was a recent paper in Cell that's trying to address this issue. So if you remember, when you get a viral infection, They're essentially two responses. You have a T cell response, which is a cellular response, and a B cell response, which is the humoral response. T cells are required to educate the B cells to go ahead and produce antibodies. And those antibodies are directed generally to various parts of the viral protein where the T cells can recognize those that are in memory, can stimulate a memory B cell to become active again. So the real question is, we've been chasing the spike protein. And as I've said many times, if you just chase spike proteins, what will happen is it'll change and then your immune protection goes away. So here, if you'll recall, is what the coronavirus looks like. It's called a coronavirus because it's like a crown. These spike proteins are trimeric proteins, and then many, many different amino acids can be mutated there. So these vary quite a bit. There are parts of the virus that are actually pretty stable, and there are three in particular, the nucleocapsid proteins. Those are the proteins that actually bind the RNA of the virus. There are the envelope proteins that create the envelope of the virus. And then there's an open reading frame that is really encodes structural proteins that are part of the viral envelope and viral structural forms. Those do not change a lot. And so if you could develop an immune response to those areas, those conserved proteins, then it's possible that you might get a more broadly effective antibody or immune response. So there was a recent paper in Cell that was just published 2 weeks ago that tried to create a vaccine that would direct T cells to recognize those three conserved domains. And so they did that in a hamster model, and they showed that it had broad protection. They even combined it with the traditional bivalent vaccine. And in hamsters, they were able to protect from all the viral variant challenges. So here's a good example of taking the conserved parts of the virus, creating a strong T cell response, combined with the bivalent vaccine, and getting broad immunity against many of the different variants. So that's what we really need, rather than just chasing all the mutations in the spike protein and each time coming up with another variant to that. We need something that's broadly neutralizing. So that was a very important paper. It's currently in phase 2 trial, so hopefully something like that will come up. Now, the other interesting thing, I have a lot of friends who have developed immune complications after getting COVID or even getting the vaccine. And so there's been a couple of studies that looked at the risk of people who have autoimmune phenomena, autoimmune disease, after they get COVID. And there was a paper that was published in The Lancet with over 3.8 million participants. They had about almost 900,000 cases compared to about 3 million controls. And what they showed was, if you look at case to controls, threefold increase in a number of autoimmune diseases: rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus, vasculitis, inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, and importantly, type 1 diabetes. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but type 1 diabetes, insulin-dependent diabetes, seems to be a complication of getting COVID, and it's also been occasionally reported after getting the vaccine as well. So the interpretation from this study was that if you have autoimmune disease, COVID makes it really worse, and even a threefold increase in the various diseases. But you want a confirmatory study, and there was a second study that did the same sort of thing in 650,000 patients, and what they showed was about a 43% increase in acquired autoimmune diseases after patients who had gotten COVID. So one was threefold, 50% increase is 1.5-fold. But again, two good studies, large studies, that looked at the autoimmune complications associated with SARS-CoV-2. So bottom line is, if you have autoimmunity in your family or you actually suffer from an autoimmune disease, getting COVID is going to make it worse and not induce actually other types of autoimmunity. So I want to end today with a bunch of shout-outs. First of all, this is Mental Health Awareness Month, and since 1949, the month of May has been observed as National Mental Health Awareness Month. And as you know, during the pandemic, we saw a huge amount of problems with mental health disorders, not only in adults, but particularly in isolated adolescents and kids. And so this is a really good time to think about the mental health problems in our community that are really soaring. And, you know, there are plenty of opportunities if you need someone to help. If you know someone who needs help, reach out to their physician, reach out to them. Don't just ignore it. Then I also want to congratulate Dr. Max Hershkowitz, who received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Sleep Foundation. This is the foundation's highest honor and recognized individuals have demonstrated exemplary leadership in the field of sleep. I myself have demonstrated exemplary leadership in sleeping, sometimes during the day. But anyway, Dr. Hershkowitz is a professor of the Department of Medicine at Baylor, founded the Sleep Disorders and Research Center at the DeVake UVA. So congratulations, Dr. Hershkowitz. And then, of course, this is National Nurses Week. Tomorrow marks the beginning of National Nurses Week and concludes on May 12th on Florence Nightingale's birthday. Who knew? What a good idea, though. And big shout out to all the nurses. We couldn't have gotten through the pandemic without them. And they were under a lot of stress during the whole pandemic. And so we depend very heavily on the nursing profession, and we want to be sure that they feel appreciated and supported. So anyway, have a great weekend. I can't wait to see you next week.